Hello, you're listening to the Total Motorsport F1 Show. I'm your host, Joe Krishnan, and I'm joined by Ewan, Gale and Brandon Sutton as we review the Belgian Grand Prix after the wonderful race at the Spa-Francorchamps circuit. After a long summer break, we're back racing, even if the weather didn't seem like it was summer. The rain threatened to ruin our Sunday afternoon just like it did in 2021, but thankfully it cleared up in time. Lando Norris led under the rolling start from the safety car, but Oscar Piastri hunted him down and never looked back. Now, guys, what did you make of that battle at the front? If you can call it that, Ewan, because I think we were robbed of a battle for many reasons, which we'll look into right now. So, yeah, what did you think of that?
Yeah, I mean, robbed. It depends which way you look at it. Yes, we were robbed of side by side racing. And the flip side of that is we had two of the fastest drivers on the grid at the minute, having to, or at least one of them in Lando Norris chasing down Piastri towards the end, having to put qualifying lap after qualifying lap in what were still difficult conditions on the green track after the rain. Um, to try and reel his teammate in. So that was exciting, and that's where the mistakes came. But really, the big mistake was, as you said, the rolling start. We an 80-minute delay because of the weather conditions. Then we had four laps on the safety car. Norris takes over for the rolling start. Doesn't have a standing start, which he would have been happy about because of how much wetter the right hand side of the grid was compared to the left hand side of the grid. Right hand side being where pole position was. Um, but he didn't quite get the jump right. He went in a bit of no man's land after Blanchimont before the final chicane. Piastri read it like a book, and was able to stick close. A bit of a slide for Norris at turn one as well. Just gave Piastri all the momentum he needed, and he was passed easily before the Leclerc braking zone. So that was the big mistake that Norris made. The other mistakes, understandable, I think, in the conditions and the situation he found himself in. But losing that strategic high ground in a race where you knew there was going to be a crossover point between intermediate tyre and slick tyre was the big mistake that Norris made. And, you know, that was the difference between the two in the end. Piastri never really had to look behind himself too much, even though he was trying to keep hold of medium tyres towards the end of the race. And he showed actually in the last two laps that he kept a bit of life there, in waiting just in case there was a battle to be had. So I don't think he would have been as close as perhaps it would have seemed 10 laps out from the end if Norris had kept the car on the road without any mistakes. Um, but you just have to hand it to Piastri. He made no mistakes and was perfect, and he made Norris work for it, and Norris couldn't draw that back in, and that's the type of thing that can be the difference between winning the championship and winning or coming second. So I don't think there's too much to read into it. We didn't get the side by side action. We will throughout the season. There's still a long way to go yet.
I think I think on the rolling start in the lab one, Norris was his hands were kind of tied anyway, just with how Spa works. We saw the day prior that Piastri was blasted straight past by Verstappen. Last year, I think it was Perez on pole maybe, or Leclerc. Yeah, it was Leclerc on pole. Hamilton picked off Perez straight away, then picked off Leclerc because it's just how powerful the slipstream is. There's a famous "Here comes Sebastian Vettel" call. Um, I think like obviously the moment at the exit of La Source didn't help, but in an equal engine, in an equal car with a slipstream, I think Norris had his hands tied as far as defending that position when before even dealing with the battery issue that McLaren said he had. I think the most frustrating thing about this race and kind of this season really is something always keeps Piastri and Norris from going wheel to wheel. So sometimes Norris will qualify a couple of places behind. They'll give Piastri 3 or 4 seconds that he needs to manage the rest of the race. At the weekend, the strategy gave Piastri a big enough gap that he could manage his tyres. It's happened quite a few times throughout the season. Um, they just seem split from going wheel to wheel. So there's only 16 points in the title race, but there's barely been any memorable moments, and it's a really strange season in that regard. That it kind of feels a bit boring at the front. I don't know. It's just unusual. I feel like the Belgian GP was another example of that.
Yeah, I think there's something to be said for, the title battles we've had over the years that were very close. So you've got obviously Hamilton versus Verstappen, 2021. That's the main one for me that sticks out. But also you had Hamilton versus Vettel. Um, and yeah, I mean, even prior to that, obviously Hamilton Rosberg, where you're getting these exciting battles and like the drivers might take each other out or there's like an incident which means one of them goes down the order and that can sort of cause the title race to sort of seesaw a bit, whereas I feel like Piastri being a bit more conservative, and just doing the job that's in front of him, Norris being a little bit of a wild card in that he could be sensational one week and then either a little bit more average or mistake ridden another one, so we're not, like you say, we're not getting that wheel to wheel combat, which I think the fans need to sort of really get engaged into this championship battle. I think having Verstappen as a third person, as a third party in that championship would have made it more exciting, but because of Red Bull's, poor car this year, and yeah, obviously structural changes, we're not going to get that. So it could be a
There's
close
a big reason
championship
for that,
battle.
though. There was a big reason for that on Sunday, in that because they're both in the same car, there was always going to be a big gap after the pit stop to change from intermediates to dry tires compared to a normal race. So look, maybe if it was completely dry, it would have been a 3 second gap. But when you take into account undercut, overcut, etc., especially on a long lap like Spa, so 3 or 4 seconds, but that's easily doable for Norris to pull that gap in, right? But in this situation, having to stay out on chewed up intermediate tires while your teammate's got an undercut and he's on slick tires, on the medium tires, um, there was always going to be that big gap. Um, so whereas you flip that to, like you say, Verstappen against Hamilton a couple of years ago, they were different teams. They could have pitted on the same lap, it would have been closer all the way through the race. So I hear your point, but in this situation, it was always going to be a big gap between the two cars. What I would say is, I think it's nice that, yes, it's the same team, it's McLaren, and they run in similar setups on their cars. That's clear to see. We didn't have one car on a mega low downforce, one car on a high downforce setup. But what they are doing in the race is they're very much a split team between the garages, doing the strategy that the drivers want. I think they've realised that it's a two-horse race for the championship, and they are giving the drivers the freedom to try and get after each other on strategy, like we saw with Norris's side this week, just gone, where they gave him the hard tyre to try and do something different and close Piastri and maybe towards the end, or if Piastri had to pit. That's a breath of fresh air. That's really refreshing. So I think going forward, and especially as this championship starts getting closer to the wire, that will exaggerate a little bit more as well, and it will feel like a two-team battle in a way because the sides of the garages will split. And then I think we'll get more towards the Hamilton Rosberg type battle that we saw 2014, 15, 16 when the Mercedes were dominant, and no one could get close to them. I think that will bring the spice and the energy to the title fight that maybe title fight that we've lacked so far this season. But I think that's understandable when we've still until very recently had Verstappen in that fight and even Russell early on in the season with the results he was picking up. I think as McLaren continue to draw away in that fight in the standings, and the fight does just zone in between a Piastri versus a Norris, then that split between the two garages on a race day strategy wise will become more apparent. I think that's where we'll get the excitement.
Just so far, it all feels very, very professional. Like even with comments in the media, they're both highly PR trained at this point. That there's the most tension we've had was Piastri in Silverstone, and even he said, "I'm just not going to talk about it." And then a few weeks later, it was like, "Yeah, the team have explained it to him." So even in the media, there's not any like kind of little jabs between Norris and Piastri at the other one, which you were getting with Hamilton and Rosberg, Hamilton and Verstappen, even Hamilton and Vettel, and they were good friends. So it does feel like it should be a really interesting title race, and it should get more interesting because eventually, if Piastri keeps extending the gap, Norris will have to take more and more risks. But just so far, it feels everything's felt very cat and mouse, and like it's all boiling under the surface, and it's not really arrived so far. And with 13 races into the season now, so I really do hope it shows up soon because, yeah, I just feel like it's been quite a forgettable title race, really, at the moment.
Yeah, again, I do think that boils down to the fact that McLaren might have had an eye over the shoulder, just looking at who's behind them still in the fight. Now we're starting to get to the point where it is only Norris and Piastri. We're still waiting for that flashpoint as well. We know Norris is the type of person to put his hand up if he's made a mistake, and we know that Piastri is like Mr. Freeze, isn't he? He's so ice cold and so level headed. But they haven't had a reason to go at each other yet either, to be completely honest with you. And even when Norris hit Piastri in Canada, like the first thing he said was sorry. So there was no need for Piastri to stick the boot in either. And it helped that Piastri finished the race where he was when he got hit as well. So it will there will be a change, I'm sure, after the summer break when they realise that it's just those two now in the championship fight, that they will have to start getting a little bit tense, I guess, and elbows out with each other. The garages will start to split, as we've seen in intra-team battles down the years, and there will be a flashpoint. The history dictates that there will be. Um, Even with Hamilton and Verstappen a few years ago, they had a few close calls, but it didn't really come until Monza, really, where we had the big bang, if you like, and that's where the nastiness came in. Before then, it was sort of a little bit of tension, but again, they weren't really sticking a knife in. All of the animosity was coming from Wolf and Horner off track. And again, you're not going to get that with this battle because you're not going to have Zach Brown against Zach Brown, are you? So I think all of that excitement is yet to come. I think it's a little bit like a cycling race so far. You are right. There hasn't been that needle yet. It's almost like they're part of the same peloton, and then all of a sudden you're going to have the breakaway in the last half of the stage, and that breakaway will come down to a really tense, fiery sprint, and that's when you get the crashes, and that's when you ultimately get the champion at the end.
I do want to just go back to that point you said about the drivers choosing their strategy, and I think that's a good point because it's almost giving more accountability to the drivers to make the decisions that affect their own championship, right? Because I think sometimes there are a few drivers on the grid, not going to name any names, but will seek to blame the team first before themselves. Um, when actually, the data breakdown that we saw from Nico Rosberg, which I thought was really interesting for someone like myself who's not massively into the technical stuff, but he was like explaining very straightforwardly that like there's certain corners, there's certain braking points and throttle points where it's making that just tiny difference, but it could make a tenth of a difference in the race or qualifying. And that is down to the driver. But there's no two ways about it. You're analyzing that data, unless there's a problem with the car, which I doubt in this scenario there would be. You know, you can see where the drivers are making those marginal gains, and that's really important because that is genuinely about who's quicker, who's finding the bits of the track, extra, couple of meters here and there. Um, so pit strategy is obviously so important, as we saw with Yuki Tsunoda, for example. One lap cost him 5 places, and you know, and again, it was that split second. They just waited just too long to tend to come to the pits. So again, it's with the drivers. They're coming under the radio and saying, Oscar, you know, what kind of tire do we want? When do you want to come in? and they're giving their feedback and they're going from that. Of course, they've got all the data in front of them, but they want the drivers to be starting making those decisions so that they're accountable, so that the team can say, well, we've given the drivers the responsibility to do that. And I think that's really important so that that there can be no sort of, what's the word, like accusations of favoritism within the garage, because those are happening behind the scenes on social media. But I think McLaren are doing very well to make sure that doesn't become an issue.
And it's another indicator as well that they're starting to take that eye from over their shoulder to look forward now. But at this battle between the two, because if Verstappen was still in this battle, they would be employing a strategy and telling both drivers what the strategy is to make sure that McLaren get a 1-2. Whereas this was a strategy for Norris to try and beat Piastri and for Piastri to try and beat Norris. So, that's where, and going back to the point, I think that's where this championship is going to be exciting now is that's what we're going to see for the rest of the season as well. It's going to be how do we get in front of Piastri? How do we get in front of Norris? Depending on what side of the garage you're on. And you're right about that data analysis as well. The best bit of analysis I've seen on TV for a long, long time. And you're right. The fine margins will win a weekend and lose a weekend. We saw in the sprint on Saturday, the fine margin was that Verstappen and Red Bull called it perfectly. They knew that they didn't have to look after the tyres so much in the shortened sprint race, so they gave Verstappen the best weapon that they could to go and win that sprint race. Um, Same with Piastri. That little margin through the corners, I think it was down into Fanya that they were showing that he was staying in a higher gear than Norris. That was the margin that got him that got him ahead in sprint qualifying. But that's something that Norris would have looked at and reacted to, and that's why he ended up on pole for the Sunday. And that's the credit that you've got to give Norris, considering everyone's been questioning his mentality this season. Is that he's had his blip, he came back, he won in Austria, he then won in Silverstone as Piastri made the mistake behind the safety car. He was then way off the pace of Piastri on Friday in Spa, finished behind him in the sprint, but reacted and adapted and overcame that to get pole for Sunday. Okay, he didn't get the start quite right, and Brandon's absolutely right. Being second sometimes is better at Spa than being first, although I think the rolling start should have helped Norris consolidate that. And that one moment, again talking fine margins, that first lap dictated which driver would be 8 seconds down the road come the crossover point. But I don't think that this weekend was about mentality of the drivers. It was, like you said, fine margins on which driver could get what he needed to do done when it absolutely mattered. And on this occasion, it was Piastri. In Austria, it was Norris. And it will keep flip flopping. What Piastri's got is the advantage of the points buffer now. And that comes from Norris's struggles in that patch where Piastri was winning everything as well.
Thing though, and Nico Rosberg touched on it. I don't know if Max Verstappen would have made those mistakes trying to chase down Piastri. And yeah, Rosberg said Lewis Hamilton wouldn't make those mistakes, even though I think this version of Lewis would. But yeah, it's just sometimes it feels like even when they're chasing each other down and they get close, both of them can't quite keep the errors out of their driving, and it does just take an extra second, and then sometimes that's a race like we saw on, I think it was lap 44 with that lock up into turn one, and then that was it. Piastri was gone. I'm not sure he would have caught him anyway, but it definitely made it a formality afterwards.
Yeah.
I think that's another thing with this title race is, like, again, I guess we were spoiled with 2021, where you had Hamilton and Verstappen with that unrelenting consistency in the race pace. And we have to accept that they're an exception to the rule, but I don't know. Even in this title race, it feels as though they can't quite keep the mistakes out of the driving. One of them's always got one in them on Sunday or Saturday, or several of them, as it seems to be. So I hope this championship doesn't come down to which one of them makes fewer mistakes rather than which one of them puts in brilliant performances.
And do you know what? And you're absolutely right. Both of them are making the mistakes when it matters. And 100% Hamilton, when he came in, wouldn't have made the mistakes. Verstappen, probably in his first title year, made a few mistakes, but since then he's been imperious. Schumacher made very little mistakes. He was always at the limit. But I think it's understandable, these mistakes. They're both had a period of time where they haven't fought for a championship. Piastri won a championship more recently than Norris, but think about what's happened since then for Piastri. It's been a good few years for them. They haven't been at the top of race classifications until the second half of last season. And then they're thrust into this situation where they're both fighting for a driver's title that who knows what's going to happen next year. This might be their only chance. This is maximum pressure for both of the drivers. And the mistakes are understandable. And, they're not massive mistakes either. It's not like they're going and shunting the car into the wall every week. They are tiny. I mean, Norris, two lockups and a slight twitch through the fastest corner on the race circuit on a green racetrack after a load of rain. You look at Piastri with his safety car thing in Silverstone. Again, it's a tiny mistake, and maybe the 10 seconds was harsh. We've talked about that. Again, both of them went off the road in Australia. It was Piastri that ended up rotating. Norris got away with it. They're small mistakes. They're not huge mistakes. And when the pressure's that big, what we're going to see as that pressure cooker ramps up towards the end of the year is which of the two cope with it better. I wouldn't look too much into the first half of the season. It's from now on, really. What mistakes are they going to make? Are they going to be the difference between finishing first or second and seventh or eighth? Because if you're making a mistake and finishing second, you're not losing too much ground. The likelihood is that Norris would have finished second anyway in that race because Piastri was given the chance for however many laps to keep life in his tyres. The question is going to be is when they're a second apart, will one of them run off the road and end up finishing eighth and lose a massive amount of ground? Or will they slightly run off the road, maybe not lose that, maybe not win that race, but live to fight another day, not losing too much ground in the championship? If that's the mistake they're making, as long as it's not every single race, then they'll live. But it's sliding off the track and having a crash. That's when you can turn around and say, guys, don't know if you're championship material if you're making that mistake in the second half of the season when it's just a two-horse race.
Now, I don't think any other driver had their mistakes amplified quite as much as this weekend as Lewis Hamilton, or in terms of the effect that those mistakes had on his weekend. You know, you spin out in SQ1, eliminated. You get through to Q2, sorry, but then you get your lap time deleted due to a very, very minor, but obviously, you can't argue against the track limits violation. So both times Hamilton, it's rare to see him make those kind of mistakes, I think, but you're seeing a driver who's trying to prove himself in a new team, I think, trying to prove he's still got it, trying to outdrive the car, possibly, because we know he's not completely happy with what the SF75 has got at the moment in terms of the package. He's made that pretty clear. But he put his hands up and said, like, sorry, this was my fault. I apologize to the team. It's not good enough. And then obviously on Sunday, he does recover some ground with some, I would say, ballsy overtakes. I think that was definitely like the Hamilton of old. And obviously, unfortunately, the lifting coating kind of denied him that last battle with Alex Albon, I think. But, this is it's been a bit of a costly weekend for Lewis. Would you agree with that, Brandon?
It doesn't look good on paper to be out of both G1 sessions, although there is context behind that, and considering the fact that they only had one practice session, it's a new rear suspension. And then it has emerged that Hamilton was right when he said Leclerc has been running a different part in his car since Canada. They had something to do with the brakes is new. I think it might be the calipers, I'm not entirely sure. But that seems to have caught him out. And I mean, it did seem miserable on Saturday. Like, yeah, it did seem miserable. I would have been in a dark place if I was an F1 driver, because yeah, it's a whole weekend gone at one of your like favorite and best tracks. But then he came out on Sunday and he gave himself a lot of encouragement with how aggressive he was in his overtakings, how quick he was, and where he was finding the pace compared to everyone else. And then, yeah, like you said, with the lifting coast and the fact that it became dry, yeah, that kind of took the rest of the chance to fight away from him. Yeah, the interesting thing would have been what would have happened if the FIA started the race a bit earlier. How far would he have managed to go up the order before the crossover point, which he seemed to nail? Could he have got himself into a podium fight? I don't know. But either way, like, to go from the pit lane to seventh after, and to show the kind of mental fortitude to fight back from what was a weekend where he could have just thrown the towel in if he wanted to. I think that's actually really encouraging for him going forwards. I'm not entirely sure Hamilton from last year would have found that motivation. So, yeah, hopefully he can pick it up in Hungary because that is one of his best tracks. Yeah, it's just a tricky weekend that he's managed to save a pretty solid result out of.
Yeah, absolutely, and you're absolutely right. You know, the Friday wasn't really his fault. It was everything with the new part, and the rear brake locking was just weird into the final chicane. That's what saw him out, and you know, running off track in qualifying proper, his mistake. Then he owned up to that. But he was awesome on Sunday. Really, I mean, you look at the ground that everyone else was unable to make up. Um, you're thinking similar car performance, and you look at what Antonelli was able to do in the Mercedes in comparison. Like it was night and day. So really awesome from Lewis on the Sunday. But you know, the lifting coasting, that's been a problem since China, obviously, when they got disqualified. And the more I think about it, the more I think that set Lewis back an awful long way. I don't know whether it's the same on Leclerc's side. He seems to not run away from Verstappen on Sunday, even though maybe we would have expected him to, having been ahead of him the whole race. You know, Verstappen was a thorn in his side. So maybe it is the same on Leclerc's side. That Ferrari should be a lot quicker than it is, and we know that there is inherent performance in there from what Hamilton did in the Chinese sprint. All of these documents that he's sending around just show how driven he is. The fact that he is pinpointing all of the areas and all the departments that need to improve for Ferrari to get on the front foot next season. He's so determined not to be another Vettel or another Alonso in that Scuderia red. I think that's so impressive at his age, and it really is a testament to his mentality, to uh, his drive, his desire, and anyone who questions how pumped up he is to get another title to his name just needs to look at the work he's doing off the track at the moment. We know that he hasn't really enjoyed this generation of car, especially when he was running experiments at Mercedes to try and get their issues sorted out, but doesn't necessarily like this generation of car. He can't drive the way that he perhaps finds it most comfortable. Yeah, would you expect him to adapt a little better? Probably, but que sera. Next season, will that change? Potentially, the car will be different. They might have different characteristics, but he's also able with Leclerc to lead, and that's what he's doing. He is leading Ferrari's charge into next season. So that's got to be a positive thing. And the performances are coming. Yeah, Friday, Saturday weren't great, but again, Sunday show you exactly what you can still do behind the wheel of an F1 car. Um, it needs a good result in Hungary, I think, to go into the summer break energized, and then he can come back. There's a lot of circuits still to come that we know he loves, and I wouldn't be surprised if he's right up there with the Leclerc two-prong Ferrari attack, making sure they finish second in the constructors.
I do want to touch on the adaptability thing, though. I think that has been dramatically overplayed throughout Hamilton's era in the ground effect, just because of who he actually is, the expectations placed on him, and the teammates he's up against. If you've looked at everyone who switched teams throughout this ground effect era, all of them have struggled to adapt to a new car. You've got
Mm.
Hulkenberg, who's struggling to out-qualify Bortoleto. Ocon's being matched by Behrman. Sainz is struggling at Williams, and these are just the guys who have moved this season. The only one who didn't seem like he struggled is Fernando Alonso, but he's got Lance Stroll, so it's not really much of a reference to understand. So I think it's just really hard to actually change teams in this era with how these cars are driven, how the driving styles interact with the tyres and everything else. But then Hamilton's not got some kind of fodder driving next to him. He's got George Russell and Charles Leclerc. And if you're looking outside of Max Verstappen, I'd say it's almost unanimous how people will nominate those two as the best two on the grid. So for Hamilton to be 40 years old, for his motivation to have probably been in the toilet after that 2021 Abu Dhabi Grand Prix, and then for him to only be a couple of temps off, we're talking some of the best drivers that have entered the sport who are in the mid-20s, literally the physical prime of their lives. I really don't think it's that bad, especially considering that he doesn't suit this car style too much. His qualifying was a bit rough from the end of 2023 to 2024, but now it seems relatively solid.
Yeah,
he needs to chip away at a little bit. And his race pace was there all the way through last year. Struggled a little bit at the start of this year, but clearly it's not a good Ferrari car and he's moving teams and all that kind of stuff that I've just mentioned. So I'm sure next year, when we go back to more of a flat on the floor in the car, you should expect to see more of a pre-2022 Lewis Hamilton. But even Hamilton through this ground effect era hasn't been his traditional self, but he's not been bad either.
Yeah, and you are right, mate, in that it's also the first year that he's racing without a Mercedes engine in F1. And the drivability difference will be massive and something he's got to adjust all of his internal gyros to. You think about that feel between brain and foot and knowing how to apply the power, that will be a challenge for him, as it was for Sainz at Williams with the Mercedes as well. And the other thing for Hamilton as well is that his race pace has been there the last few races and he's been unlucky. He had damage at Silverstone, he had damage at Canada. Um, and damage that is not coming through contact with other people. He's just picking it up with debris or whether it was an animal in Canada as well. So, yeah, you're right. The race pace is clearly still there, and maybe we do expect too much from him. But then that's sort of what you get when you're a seven-time world champion as well.
So, in terms of big departures from F1, just moving on a bit, obviously, the last 3 weeks or so have been dominated by the departure of Christian Horner. Um, it was the first weekend at the helm for Laurent Mekies with Red Bull. I wouldn't say it's been a disaster at all, considering some of the results, not just from Verstappen, but also, the second driver, Yuki Tsunoda. I think, he got into Q3, which is a positive for him, one of his best qualifying performances of the season. And, Mekies was the first to say, what, we screwed up the pit stop. We apologized to him. It was just a matter of timing, but we messed it up for him. He probably would have got a points finish had we not done that. And obviously with Verstappen, I think, yeah, obviously he won the sprint race, which we know he's fantastic in sprint races. Fourth is still, I think, respectable, considering I still think he's outpacing that car. But it does seem like the the animosity has lifted a little bit from Red Bull. Maybe the hot air, I guess you could say. And obviously Jos Verstappen was interviewed by Nico Rosberg, wasn't he? And he was a little bit reluctant to comment on the situation. But how did you see how Red Bull managed their first weekend of the Meckies?
I
I
actually
mean, go on.
I actually really like that Mekies came in and he's not tried to settle in really so much as just to keep the ship running for the first few weeks where he gets things up to order. It came out that Tsunoda's not been running the updates because they've been keeping them in reserve for Verstappen in case he breaks something on his car. I'm a really big fan of the fact that Mekies has come straight in and said, we're not doing that anymore. Put the updates onto Tsunoda's car and immediately Tsunoda's been rewarded. And do you think that they've been doing that now? I guess you would assume they've been doing that for Lawson and for Perez as well. no wonder that those guys have been struggling when you're against Max Verstappen and then you're a few updates behind Max Verstappen. I'm a really big fan of the fact that Mekies is just coming in and laid that law down straight away. I think it's a really good sign of his own confidence in his leadership, and obviously everyone seems to like him. Tsunoda likes him. Verstappen's commented that he's a really good technical mind, so hopefully he can help lead the team to get back towards the front by figuring out what's going on with this car. Well, I mean, you can't really figure out what's going on with this car now, but hopefully they can get it together for 2026. But yeah, I'm just a really big fan of the fact that he's stamped his authority so quickly.
Yeah, 100%. And do you know what? The best thing you can do if you want to judge how Mekies has done since taking over is look at the body language of Yuki Tsunoda across the weekend. There was a fizz in his step. Absolutely, 100%. He was thrilled to see a smile from his boss after his qualifying performance on Saturday. And it was, like you said, it was nice that he had the upgrades as well, finally. And no, there wasn't any bashing of Sonoda after dropping out the points. Mekies came out and said, "No, we got the strategy wrong. Yuki was fabulous." So that's positive, I think. And the other thing, you're right. Technical mind, Verstappen likes that. Verstappen has moaned about the car performance for a long time now, since Perez was next to him, and he was saying last year that Perez wasn't the problem. The car's no good. No good is a bit of a stretch, but not where it should be. Um, Now they've got someone that they can talk to directly and figure out. Mekies is no mug. He's worked for the FIA. He's worked for Ferrari. You don't do that if you don't know your beans. Um, and also look at the performance of the Racing Bulls with Mekies at the helm as well. So I think is positive. We're going to miss Horner 100%. We're going to miss that. I was going to say pantomime villain, but I guess all of the team principals are pantomime villains because they all want what's best for their teams. But we're missing a key part of that opera that is F1. But Mekies brings something that I think Red Bull absolutely need at the moment.
Yeah, I
Can I
think.
just uh,
Sorry,
can I
go
just
on.
flip this onto Mercedes too as well? This is now another team principal that is a technical mind. So now we've got McLaren copying the same path. I'm wondering if Toto Wolff should consider stepping back into more of a Zach Brown kind of role, where you're still an influential figure in the team, but you're no longer driving that team anymore. Because Mercedes have struggled throughout this entire era to figure out how these cars work, and that's Toto at the helm. Maybe now they need a technical mind calling the shots, and Toto can still be the big presence in the media and all that kind of stuff because he is the CEO. Maybe
In
they
which
now need
sense
someone like James Ellison.
he can do exactly the same role as he's doing now without being the team principal, if you like.
Yeah, but it can be an F1 expert. It can be an actual technical and physics expert
Look
directing
at
which person is running which part of the team.
the example for you is Wheatley and Bonotto at Sauber.
Yeah,
Definitely.
just
Well,
straight
look,
up,
guys.
even McLaren as well. That's the best one-to-one comparison with Zach Brown, who is into motorsports, but he's not an engineer. He's still the CEO, and so many people confuse Zach with actually being the team principal. But Andreas Seller is a fantastic technical mind as well, and we saw how quickly that new structure has flipped things around for McLaren. Maybe Mercedes, this old style kind of system they've got in place, maybe it doesn't quite work for them anymore. But
Sorry,
it doesn't
Brandon.
mean they have to lose Toto.
I've got to step in. We're out of time, guys. Thanks so much for joining us, and join us next time for Hungary. Thank you. Bye.
Sorry about that. I couldn't see the